Well, after a light previous episode, because the Calgary Hitmen were stuck in COVID protocol, I'm going to say this episode is definitely going to make up for it. Anyway, for the final time for Season 3, it's time for another episode of... Hey everyone, it's Brett Hornby here, and welcome back to my YouTube channel, and welcome back to another episode of my Calgary Hitmen in 6. This is Season 3, episode number 5, and I guess I'll purposely wear my hat backwards for this game recap because everything is out of sync. As we're only going to be recapping games 15 to 21, there'll be one extra game because the Calgary Hitmen was in COVID protocol. One player tested positive and they were shut down for 2 weeks, so they were out of sync, but fortunately they were only able to get 21 games in for the 2020-21 WHL Special COVID All Alberta edition. So I'll bring up my notes, and I'm definitely going to say it definitely was the longest that I've had to put notes together for a game recap. I mean, there were 7 games, but there were a lot that happened in those 7 games, especially one game in particular, where our arch rivals are been the thorn in the side for the Calgary Hitmen. So let's go back to game number 15. As you know, everything is out of sync with COVID. But game 15, this goes back to Friday, April the 23rd, as the schedule got redrawn once the teams got back from the COVID protocol. And this was the first game that the Calgary Hitmen played since leaving COVID protocol. So on Friday, April 23rd, the Calgary Hitmen were taking on the Lethbridge Hurricanes for this weekend set. This one was at home, at the home away from home at the 7 Chiefs Sportsplex. And this was actually a 2 p.m. puck drop, so some afternoon delight for Friday afternoon. And as I said, this is the first game since leaving COVID protocol for the Calgary Hitmen. They definitely made up for some lost time in the first period, as I would say. First goal came from Josh Prokop. This was his 7th. This passed the 7.5 minute mark for Calgary to be up 1-0 at this point in the game. Then just before the 9 minute mark, it was Cale Zimmerman who scores his 4th to make it 2-0 for Calgary. And then Adam Kidd, one of the younger players for the Hitmen, he scored twice in 50 seconds. Yes, 50 seconds apart. The first one of his second goal came at 10:02 of the first period. Then the second of the game came 50 seconds later at 10:50 to put this goal tally up to 6 after his 2 goals. So Calgary had a 4-0 lead, and with 4 goals in a stretch of 3 minutes and 11 seconds. How about that to make up for some lost time? The Calgary takes a 4-0 lead after the first period and not showing any alien effects from the COVID shutdown. We don't know who that one player was that got tested positive with COVID as of this post, as I meant to say. But this is junior hockey we're talking about. However, in the second period, I'm going to say Lethbridge definitely struck back. They wanted to get into the game as well. First, it was Alex Cotton who got his 6th past the 5.5 minute mark to make it a 4-1 game at this point for Calgary. Then Alex Cotton actually scored his 2nd of the game, this time just under 2 minutes later. So now we had a 4-2 game for the Calgary Hitmen at this point in the second period. Then Dino Kembitz scores shorthanded at 12:47 to be exactly. That was his 5th of the season. So now Lethbridge scores 3 straight goals to now make it a 4-3 game for Calgary at that point. And that's actually how things stood after the second period. Calgary had 4 goals in the first period, while Lethbridge had 3 goals in the second period to tighten up the game after all. After a couple of wild periods for both sides, I think things did tighten up defensively going into the third period. There was no scoring report until the final minute of the third period, so it was a 4-3 game for most of the third period. First, Calgary scores the insurance marker with 57 seconds left to go from Brandon Why Not. Why not? It was actually his 1st of the season at that point to make it 5-3 for Calgary. Then Riley Stotts, he actually is the Toronto Maple Leafs prospect. He got his 4th of the season with 2 seconds to go in the empty net to put this one away. So Calgary comes back from the COVID shutdown with a 6-3 win over the Lethbridge Hurricanes. Lethbridge actually did outshot the Calgary Hitmen 34-26 overall in this game. So who led the way for Either side, well, obviously it was Adam Kidd for Calgary. He had 2 goals and an assist. Cale Zimmerman also chipped in with a goal and assist, and Luke Prokop and Sean Tessier also each added in 2 assists. On the Lethbridge side of the puck was Alex Cotton. He had 2 goals. And then when it comes to the goaltending story of the game, Jack Benaughton, who was in net for Calgary, he made 31 saves for Calgary. Well, Lethbridge, they had Carl Chekiak, who actually started in net, although he made 8 saves before being replaced by Jared Picklick, who made 22 saves after Calgary scored their 4th goal. So Lethbridge used both their goalies in that game. So that was game number 15. So Calgary definitely came back with a bang after being shut down for a couple weeks. So game 16, this was on Saturday, April the 24th, as the Calgary Hitmen were continuing on their weekend set with the Lethbridge Hurricanes. This time they are down in Lethbridge at the NMAX Center. This was a 7 p.m. puck drop. And they say back at it again the next night, and would say Lethbridge had a better start than the previous game, as Calgary had a 4-0 lead after the first period. However, Calgary did look a little flat in the first, but they looked better afterwards. First, Calgary actually opened up the scoring in this game, as it was Sean Tessier who got his 7th of the season, just before the 10.5 minute mark to make it 1-0 for Calgary at that point. However, Lethbridge did strike back 36 seconds later, as it was Liam Kindry who scores his 4th of the season to tie the game at 1-1. Nothing else to report, so we have a tie game after the first period at 1-1. Also to note that the Lethbridge Hurricanes outshot the Calgary Hitmen 9-3 in the first period alone. Second period, Calgary did put in a better effort, and just like the previous game, they had goal scoring terror in the second half of the second period, so they had a goal scoring terror in a short time. First, Calgary takes the lead at 2-1. It was Brandon Wynot who actually got his second goal in just as many games, just past the 5-minute mark to make it 2-1. Then Lethbridge did strike back to tie it up as Chase Wheatcroft scores his 5th past the 10.5 minute mark to make it a 2-2 game at that point. Then Calgary scores 3 goals in a 4:20 span in the second period. First was Cale Zimmerman, who got his 5th past the 13.5 minute mark to put Calgary up 3-2. Then it was Zach Funk who got his 3rd to make it 4-2 for Calgary past the 16-minute mark, so getting late into the second period. Then Sean Tessier scored his 8th, second of the game, just before the 18-minute mark to make it 5-2 for Calgary, and that's actually how things stood after the second period. Calgary having a 5-2 lead. Third period, something was unusual in hockey in general, as I'll point out. While shorthanded on a Riley Fitter-Schultz charging penalty, just before the 8-minute mark. This is something you don't see in hockey in general, regardless if it's at the National Hockey League or the Western Hockey League or even maybe Beer League. Maybe it happens in Beer League or your kids' hockey game. But Calgary actually scored shorthanded twice on the same penalty. So Calgary scored 2 more goals while shorthanded on the same penalty. First, it was Josh Prokop, just got his 8 past the 9-minute mark. Then 25 seconds later on that same shorthanded, it was Sean Tessier who got the hat trick for his 3rd of the game, just past the 9.5 minute mark. So Calgary led 7-2 at that point, and ultimately they took this game with a 7-2 win. So the Calgary Hitmen definitely have the Lethbridge Hurricanes number. The former, I always like to highlight the former Calgary Wranglers. So kind of the current Calgary versus the past Calgary battle. However, ultimately, when it comes to shots, well, Lethbridge actually outshot Calgary 29-7 after Lethbridge outshooting Calgary 9-3 in the first period. And then Calgary was led by Sean Tessier, obviously, with 3 goals for the hat trick. And then Josh Prokop had a goal and 2 assists. Cale Zimmerman also chipped in with a goal and assist. In this one, there was no one that stood out for Lethbridge for a multi-point game. So when it comes to the goaltending story, it was Jack Benaughton who made 27 saves for Calgary, while Lethbridge, they started off with Jared Picklick this time, who made 13 saves in the first 2 periods. But then he was replaced by Carl Chekiak going into the 3rd period, and he made 7 saves the rest of the way. So that was game number 16. So game 17, this is on Sunday, April the 25th, as the Calgary Hitmen were wrapping up their weekend set with the Lethbridge Hurricanes, a rescheduled weekend set, may I add, because the Calgary Hitmen were originally scheduled to be off that weekend, but then COVID happened. This was back at the home away from home at the Seven Chiefs Sportsplex in Tutina Nation for a 7 p.m. puck drop, and obviously Calgary was looking to sweep this weekend set with Lethbridge Hurricanes back at home. First period, the Calgary Hitmen did come out very strong, outplaying the Lethbridge Hurricanes With this trend, this was the trend for the game, but Lethbridge, for the first period, stood out. As I meant to say, as Calgary outshot Lethbridge 15-4. Calgary score first, just like they have every game in this weekend set. As it was Sean Teschio got his 10th past the 2.5 minute mark. So Calgary led 1-0 at that point early in the first period at 2.5 minutes in. However, Lethbridge did strike back to tie it up, so they definitely made one of their shots count, as it was Logan McCutton who got his first at 13:47. So we have a 1-1 game, despite the fact that Calgary outplayed Lethbridge for the most part. Also to highlight, there was no penalties to mention or highlight in the first period, as there have been some games where there's a ton of penalties in a couple minutes, nothing out of the ordinary, as will be one game I'll definitely touch upon later in this episode. And then you have periods with no penalties, but it's also interesting to note that it's later in the season, but there's no playoffs to report for the Western Hockey League. So anyway, getting back into the game, second period, Calgary did continue to dominate play, but Lethbridge did put in a better effort, so still 1-1 at that point. And actually the only goal for the second period went to the Lethbridge Hurricanes, as it was Logan Barlick who scored his sixth past the 17.5 minute mark. So we got to go very late into the second period, and that was a power play goal. So Lethbridge takes a 2-1 lead after the second period, and that's how things stood after the second period, with the Lethbridge Hurricanes actually up 2-1. Third period, Lethbridge actually adds their lead early, as Logan Barlick once again scores his second of the game just past the 3-minute mark, and Lethbridge takes a 3-1 lead early in the third period. And that was also on the power play, which I would say that was kind of the sore spot for the Calgary Hitmen for this shortened season, was their penalty kill. Then Lethbridge actually scores another one late in the third period. It was Nolan Boyko who got his 10th just before the 16.5 minute mark. So Lethbridge takes a 4-1 lead, and that's what we say the Lethbridge Hurricanes actually ultimately still this one to stave off being swept by the Calgary Hitmen with a 4-1 win. Calgary did outplay Lethbridge for most of the game, as what stood out in my mind. Calgary did actually outshoot Lethbridge 41-22 overall, but Lethbridge ultimately won this game, and one of their goaltender definitely stood on his head for this one after having a shaky weekend, as both goalies saw action. Lethbridge was led by Logan Barlig, who had a goal and an assist, or 2 goals and an assist, I meant to say. Then Noah Boyko chipped in with a goal and 2 assists, and you can also throw in Alex Cotton, who had 2 assists for the Lethbridge Hurricanes. And when it comes to the goaltending story, well, it was Braden Peters who was in net for Calgary. He made 18 saves, while it's Connor Chekiak who made 40 saves for Lethbridge, and definitely was the difference in this one. So that was game number 17. So game number 18, this was on Thursday, April the 29th, as the Calgary Hitmen were taking on the Red Deer Rebels on the road at the Western Air Park Centrium, 7 p.m. puck drop. And this game definitely started off wide open for both sides, as Calgary took an early penalty, as Tristan Zandy took a cross-checking penalty just past the opening minute and a half. However, actually while short-handed, Calgary actually scored short-handed and scored the first goal, as Josh Prokop got his 9th of the season past the 2.5 minute mark to make it 1-0 for Calgary, obviously, at that point. Red Deer did strike back much later in the first period. It was Carter Henderson who got a second. We're going past the 13-minute mark of the first period to make it 1-1 at that point. Calgary did strike back to make it 2-1 late in the first period, as Jackson Vandelies got his 3rd of the season past the 17.5 minute mark. However, with 8 seconds to go in the first period, the Red Deer Rebels actually tied it up, as it was Jay Sweer who got a second. So we had a 2-2 game after the first period, so this definitely was a wide open offensive game. Red Deer also outshot Calgary 17-10 in the first period. However, in the second period, I would say things did tighten up defensively on both sides after a wide open first period. One goal in the second period to highlight, as it came from the Calgary Hitmen to make it 3-2, as it was Riley Fitter-Schultz who scored his 5th past the 10-minute mark, and there was nothing else to report that stood out in the second period, so we had the 3-2 game for the Calgary Hitmen. Going into the third period, Calgary and Red Deer, I'm going to say they must like each other very much, because they played each other in overtime a couple times earlier in the season. Will this game need overtime? Well, let's find out. Third period, the tight defensive play continued for both sides. It wasn't until past the 12.5 minute mark, as Red Deer actually ties the game up at 3-3, as it was Chris Douglas who got his 6th of the season. There was nothing else to report in the third period, so as I like to say, this one needs overtime. In overtime, both sides had a couple chances to end it It wasn't until the 4:19 minute mark of the 5-5 overtime, so in the last minute of overtime, it was Calgary who scores. It was Cale Zimmerman who was the overtime hero, got his 6th of the season. So Calgary ultimately takes this one 4-3 in overtime, and this is going to be the recurring theme for Calgary Red Deer later in the episode. Spoiler alert. So Red Deer, when it comes to the shots, outshot Calgary 35-29 overall, including each side having 2 shots each in the overtime period. Calgary was led by Jackson Vanderleest from the blue line with Josh Prokop and Cale Zimmerman. Each had a goal and an assist. Then it was Riley Stotts who chipped in with 2 assists. And then if you look at the left, or the Red Deer side of the puck, as I meant to say, it was Chris Douglas who had a goal and assist. So now when it comes to the goaltending story of the game, it was Jack McNaughton who made 32 saves for Calgary. Well, it was Byron Fancy who made 25 saves for Red Deer. So that was game number 18. So game number 19, this happened on the next night on Friday, April the 30th, as the Calgary Hitmen were taking on the Edmonton Oil Kings. This was back at home at the Seven Chiefs Sportsplex for a 7 p.m. puck drop. This definitely was a huge test for the Calgary Hitmen, as the Edmonton Oil Kings definitely have been a much stronger team in the Western Hockey League the last couple of years, and if we had a full season and a full playoffs, I would dare to say the Edmonton Oil Kings look like an Memorial Cup caliber contender. And this game definitely gave me a lot to talk about in this one, as you'll find out. So actually, first it started off things well actually for Calgary, as Adam Kidd, who scores for Calgary his 7th of the season, 49 seconds in the game. So just like that, Calgary had a 1-0 lead. So a good start for the underdog Calgary Hitmen against the heavily favored Edmonton Oil Kings. However, Edmonton did strike back 3.5 minutes later, as it was Josh Williams who scored his 13th just before the 4.5 minute mark of the first period to make it a 1-1 game at that point. Then it was Josh Williams again for Edmonton who scores just past the 8.5 minute mark, so now we have a 2-1 lead for the Edmonton Oil Kings at that point. However, Calgary did tie things up past the 10 minute mark as Riley Stotts got his 5th, so now we have a 2-2 game. So about midway through the first period, it was 2-2, and Calgary was playing up with the Edmonton Oil Kings. However, Edmonton did regain the lead, as it was Matthew Robertson who scored his 4th on the power play just before the 17 minute mark. So Edmonton, I meant to say, I wish it was Calgary, but it's Edmonton who led 3-2 at that point. And that's how things stood after the first period. Edmonton leading 3-2, and I'm going to say, given the competition, the strength of schedule, I'm going to say Calgary looked pretty good, as I mentioned in my notes. So let's go into the second period, shall we? Second period, both sides looked to be on the same playing field with Calgary hanging around. So that's a positive sign right there. Edmonton did actually add to the lead past the 16 minute mark, so it wasn't until later in the second period Edmonton added to the lead. It was Ethan Kapp who scored for the Edmonton Oil Kings. That was his 3rd of the season at the time to make it 4-2 at Edmonton. So that's how things stood after the second period. It was 4-2 for Edmonton. And Calgary was looking like they were still hanging in there. Before getting to the third period, and there definitely were a lot to talk about in the third period, some Battle of Alberta elements to note. I mean, you're wondering, this is Calgary Edmonton, where's the Battle of Alberta? Well, let's say Sean Tessier took a check-in from behind penalty in the final minute of the second period. However, Edmonton actually ultimately had a misconduct penalty in that same play, a coach bench misconduct to wipe that out. So more to come in the third period as things were starting to simmer going into the third period. In the third period, Calgary did actually get within 1 first, as Edmonton did take a delay of game penalty, but that's nothing out of the ordinary just yet. As it was Sean Tessier who got his 11th just before the 3.5 minute mark to make it a 4-3 game for the Edmonton Oil Kings at that point. And I'm going to say, after that, that's as close as Calgary got in this one, as Edmonton did terribly outplay Calgary big time in the third period to really put this one away. As Edmonton scored 21 seconds later after that goal to make it 5-3, it was Jalen Lippman who scored his 15th. So Edmonton now led 5-3 at that point. So any short-lived, full hope that the Calgary Hitmen have in the third period was definitely wiped out at that point. Then Edmonton scored a couple more goals at the midway mark of the third period. First, it was Caleb Reimer who scored his 3rd just past the 9 minute mark to make it 6-3 for Edmonton. Then it was Carter Schouch who scored his 6th past the 10.5 minute mark. Now we have a 7-3 game for the Edmonton Oil Kings. They're starting to see this one starting to get out of hand, scoring-wise. But it also got out of hand on the ice with some fisticuffs. This is not the Battle of Alberta, right? Well, then it's not a Battle of Alberta in a lopsided game with some extra cricketers to know. However, just before I get to that, Edmonton actually made this one an 8-3 game, as Josh Williams scores the third of the game for the hat trick, just past the 12.5-minute mark. So the last two goals for Edmonton were also on the power play, so the Edmonton Oil Kings definitely smell blood with the Calgary Hitmen penalty kills, I meant to say. Then at the 13.5-minute mark, Jackson Van der Leest took a high-sticking penalty and a 10-minute misconduct, as frustrations were beginning to show in this one, with this being 8-3 then. Then just before the 17-minute mark, more rough stuff to note. Riley Fitter-Schultz, Zach Funk, and Tyson Galloway for Calgary. Well, you got Carson Latimer and Keegan Stanley. All each had misconduct penalties, so there was definitely some fisticuffs in this one. Aided with their Riley Fitter-Schultz taking a cross-checking penalty minor, so that's definitely a lot of junior hockey Battle of Alberta to talk about in this one. And then for the Edmonton Oil Kings, there was Blake Heward. He only had a roughing penalty on the exchange, so that was the only small part of all the melee right here. So that's all what you expect in their lopsided rivalry game. So after all that, with all the fisticuffs and the goals, they ultimately went to the Edmonton Oil Kings as they beat the Calgary Hitmen 8-3. So I guess Edmonton scored a touchdown and converted on the 2-point conversion, while Calgary only settled for a field goal in this one. And also showing that they were also the best team in the Central Division. Edmonton also outshot Calgary 37-25 overall, including 17-5 in the third period alone. So the Edmonton Oil Kings, they definitely smelt blood, and they definitely stepped on the throat and twisted on the Calgary Hitmen in this one. So Edmonton was led by Josh Williams, who had 3 goals and an assist. Connor Sauch, who had a goal and 3 assists, and Jalen Lippin had a goal and 2 assists. Only highlighting players on the Edmonton Oil Kings who had 3-point games or more, as there were definitely a lot of offense to go around, especially if your team scores 8 goals. Then when it comes to the goaltending story, well, Jack Naughton actually was in net for Calgary for all 8 goals against. He made 29 saves for Calgary, while Sebastian Kostov made 22 saves for Edmonton. Let's take a deep breath. That was game number 19 for the Calgary Hitmen against the Edmonton Oil Kings. It definitely lived up to be the Battle of Alberta. So now game 20. This happened on Sunday, May the 2nd, as the Calgary Hitmen were taking on the Red Deer Rebels at the 7 Chiefs Sportsplex 4 p.m. puck drop, and this was the final home game for the Calgary Hitmen in the 2021 WHL shortened season. How would you say the Calgary Hitmen will fare after being badly outplayed and dominated and beaten up by the Edmonton Oil Kings? We'll find out. And also, will this one need overtime? Well, anyway, let's get to the game. First period, Calgary did have a strong start after outplaying Red Deer in the first period. Calgary did open up the scoring in the first period as Sean Teschio got his 12th of the season past the 9.5-minute mark to make it 1-0 for Calgary at that point. However, Red Deer did strike back. It was Kalen Lynn who scored his third at the 15:46 to be exact in the first period to tie the game up at 1-1. Nothing else to report after the first period, so we had a 1-1 game. After the first period, are we sensing overtime? Because Calgary Red Deer in the past seemed to like to play overtime. Will this trend continue? So after the first period, I'm going to say the second period, I'm going to say Red Deer played a little better. In the second period, I'm going to say Red Deer outplayed Calgary in the second period after Red Deer was outplayed by Calgary in the first period. Red Deer actually took a 2-1 lead as it was Arshit Baines who scored his 7th past the 4-minute mark, so fairly early in the second period to make it 2-1 for Red Deer. However, Calgary did strike back over 2 minutes later as it was Tyson Galloway for Calgary, ties it up at 2-2 on his 4th past the 6.5-minute mark. And actually that's how things stood after the second period. We now have a 2-2 game after it was 1-1 in the first period. Now it's 2-2 after the second period. One thing to note before going to the third period is that Connor Gobbridge, who took a cross-checking game misconduct penalty past the 17.5-minute mark. This is as heated as this game got. Compared to the last game, this was very, very mild and tame by comparison. But something to highlight just other than goals. I like to highlight when it comes to my game recaps. Then third period, Red Deer did strike early and took a 2-goal lead. So after it was 2-2, Red Deer scored twice to make it a 4-2. First, it was Kalen Lynn who scored his second of the game just past the opening minute to make it 3-2 for Red Deer. So Red Deer definitely struck early into the third period. Then there was Arshit Baines, who actually also scored his second of the game at exactly 2 minutes later. So Red Deer found themselves up 4-2 past the 3-minute mark of the third period. So Calgary has some work to do if they want to come back, maybe play in overtime and win this one. However, just over a minute later, actually Calgary got one back. It was Zach Funk for the Calgary Hitmen. Scored his fourth just before the 4.5-minute mark. So now we have a 4-3 lead at that point for Red Deer. And definitely was a lot of goals early part of the third period. Calgary then was seeking the tying goal, but they had to wait and to get their goal, and eventually they got it as Calgary tied it up at 4-4. That was Adam Kidd who scored his 8th on the power play at 11:45 in the third period. So we have a 4-4 game going into the later part of the third period. And guess what? There was no more scoring to report, so as I like to say, this one needs overtime. No surprise, the Calgary Hitmen and the Red Deer Rebels playing overtime? I don't say. And that's exactly what they seem to like to do. They like to play it in overtime. Now in overtime, Calgary had the first shot, but Red Deer came back and actually scored on their shot, as it was Josh Tarzol who scored the winner on the 7th, 25 seconds into the overtime. So, as in Red Deer, it takes this one 5-4 with an overtime win for the last home game for the Calgary Hitmen for this season. Calgary had a slight shot, edge in shots, 33-31, including one shot each for both sides in overtime. Calgary was led by Adam Kidd, who had a goal and assist, and Jackson Van at least chipped in with 2 assists. Red Deer was led by Kalen Lynn with 2 goals and assists, and Archie Baines with 2 goals. So 2 players scored 2 goals each for the Red Deer Rebels. So when it comes to the, and then also I should mention that Ben King chipped in with 3 assists for Red Deer, and Kyle Masters had 2 assists. So a couple players helped out in the cause for the Red Deer Rebels. Now when it comes to the goaltending story of the game, was Jack Minot, who made 26 saves for Calgary, while Chase Coward, who made 29 saves for the Red Deer Rebels. So that was game number 20. So game number 21, this was the final game for the Calgary Hitmen for this season. Final game until at least next fall, and hopefully we'll be back under normal circumstances with with fans in attendance, and B, back at the Saddledome, because they were at the 7G Sportsplex because the Calgary Flames and the Stockton Heat were occupying the Saddledome and had to follow COVID protocol. But this game on Tuesday, May the 4th, as the Calgary Hitmen were finishing up the season with the Red Deer Rebels, this time in Red Deer at the Western Park Centrium. 7 p.m. puck drop for the last game for the 2021 season, and the idea asked, will this one need overtime? Because Calgary Red Deer definitely played a lot of overtime. I think this, counting the previous 4 games, they played in overtime in 4 of those games. Well, this one need overtime. Well, let's find out. And Calgary did actually start off strong, looking to end the season on a high note, playing out Red Deer for the most part. However, Red Deer actually got the first goal in this game, so Red Deer actually struck first. Calgary had the better start, as it was Mason Ward who scored his second at exactly 16:43 of the first period. So Red Deer took a 1-0 lead at that point. And that's actually how things stood after the first period, as it was 1-0 for Red Deer. Second period, things got a little chippy and interesting, especially later in the period. So another kind of battle of Alberta, this time with Calgary and Red Deer. First, Quinzel roughing penalties happened past the 6-minute mark with Cale Zimmerman for Calgary and Kyle Masters for Red Deer. First, Calgary, before I get to some of the rough stuff, Calgary actually did tie up the game at 1-1 as John Teschio got his 13th past the 16.5-minute mark on a power play on an ineligible penalty. So Red Deer took an ineligible player penalty that Calgary took advantage of to tie up the game on 1-1, as it was Zach Smith who got caught for the ineligible player. However, after that goal, there's been some fisticuffs to note. You have Blake Allen for Calgary and Zach Funk for Calgary, with Jace Isley and Dylan Mellon, I was meant to say. Dylan Mellon, trying to say that 10 times fast, for the Red Deer, took fighting penalties at 16:48 of the second period. Add in misconducts for Zach Funk for Calgary and Dylan Mellon for Red Deer. After all that settled down, Calgary did take their first lead of the game, as there was Riley Stotts who got his 6th of the season past the 18-minute mark of the second period. So Calgary took a 2-1 lead after the second period, and that's how things stood at the second period. So going into the third period, Red Deer did eventually strike back to tie it up at 2-2. First, it was Ben King who scored his 11th on the power play past the 9-minute mark, so about midway through the third period, the Red Deer Rebels made it a 2-2 game. Another close game against the Calgary Hitmen and the Red Deer Rebels. However, it looked like Red Deer was going to steal this one to close out the season, as later in the third period, it was Ben King who scored a second of the game at exactly 16:45 to make it 3-2 for the Red Deer Rebels. Maybe we won't need overtime, or do we? However, going into the final minute with the goalie pulled, Calgary actually did tie it up at 3-3 at exactly 19:13 as Josh Prokop scored his 10th of the season. And ultimately, guess what? This one needs overtime. Both Calgary and Red Deer like to play in overtime. That's definitely been the theme. As the three games all in this recap, they all needed overtime. And I believe Calgary and Red Deer, if you looked earlier in the season on this playlist, they also played in overtime. So that's definitely been the theme. Calgary and Red Deer love to play this one in overtime. So overtime, it was like a Wild Wild West shootout as both sides had chances to win this one. Ultimately, it was Adam Kidd for the Calgary Hitmen who scores the winner at 4:21 of the overtime period, so in the final minute of the 3-3 overtime, on his 9th of the season, and Calgary took this one in dramatic fashion with a 4-3 win by scoring the tying goal in the final minute because I guess it's the law that the Calgary Hitmen and the Red Deer Rebels, no matter what, they have to play in overtime. So Calgary scored this one late, and then they scored late in the final minute in overtime. So I guess they like overtime, but not a shootout in this case. So that was the story for that. And Calgary outshot Red Deer 50-34-35 overall, including 6-4 in overtime. So there were definitely chances on both sides in overtime. As I say, these teams like to play each other in overtime. So now when it comes to the who led the way for each team, Calgary was led by Riley Stotts, who had a goal and 2 assists. Josh Prokop and Adam Kidd each chipped in with a goal and assist. Red Deer was led by Ben King, who had 2 goals and 1 assist. Mason Ward for Red Deer also had a goal and assist. Now when it comes to the goaltending story of the game, Braden Peters was in net for Calgary, who made 32 saves, while on the Red Deer side of the puck, it was Chase Coward who made 42 saves for Red Deer. However, Byron Francie also played for Red Deer after the tying goal for Calgary, and in overtime made 4 saves in relief. I'm not too sure exactly if it was an injury that I found or just, because this was the last game of the regular season, didn't mean anything, no playoffs. Red Deer actually was way last in the Central Division just to get an appearance in before the end of the season, but that was what I found when I recapped the stats. So that was Calgary Hitmen in 6 with 1 extra bonus game to make it up. So anyway, how did the Calgary Hitmen do against Alberta in the Central Division overall, as this is the end of the regular season and end of Season 3, because there is no WHL Playoffs or Memorial Cup as it got cancelled. So if I come back for Season 4, it will be in the fall. But getting back into the task at hand on how the Calgary Hitmen did against each team in the Central Division, all in Alberta. Well, the Edmonton Oil Kings, Calgary was 1-3-0 against the Edmonton Oil Kings. So that was how they did against Edmonton. And then against Lethbridge, Calgary was 4-2-0 against the Lethbridge Hurricanes. Then the Medicine Hat Tigers, they were 2-3-1. And then the Red Deer Rebels, they were 3-0-2 and 2 overtime losses. So, as I mentioned, Calgary and Red Deer, and I think every game that Calgary and Red Deer played this year all went to overtime. So ultimately, Calgary was only able to get 21 games in this season, as they lost some games due to COVID protocol, so they only got to play 21 games, but in 21 games, they finished the season 10-8-3 for 23 points. That put them 3rd in the Central Division. So I'll bring up, when it comes to the stats when it comes to the Calgary Hitmen, and we'll go around the WHL. What I'll put in the description, what I've done in previous seasons, is that I put in the player stats when it comes to the whole team. Just, something to capture. So let me just bring up the website here. I forgot to bring it up before I brought in coming to the video. But let's take a look at the standings, shall we? So let's go over to the U.S. division. Look at the top 3. Well, in 21 games, the Everett Silvertips, they are 17-4-0 for 34 points. Led by goaltender Dustin Wolf, Calgary Flames prospect. He's definitely been on a goaltending tear, so hopefully the future looks bright when it comes to goaltending. When it comes to the Calgary Flames, second place it was the Portland Winterhawks, a distant second after 21 games. They were 10-8-3, exactly the same record as the Calgary Hitmen for 23 points. Then the Spokane Chiefs round out the top 3 in the U.S. division with 18 games. They're 6-7-4-1 as they count overtime and shootout losses for 17 points. And actually what they did in the WHL this season is they crowned the divisional champion. So Everett got the U.S. division champion. So when it comes to the BC division, well, in 19 games, the Kamloops Blazers are 15-4-0 for 30 points, led by Connor Zary, Calgary Flames draft pick from this past year in 2020 in the first round. Then in second place, well, they based it on points percentage. Kelowna actually only got to play 12 games because they also had a COVID shutdown. They're 8-3-1 for 17 points. And then third place, they put the Prince George Cougars. In 19 games, they're 9-7-2-1 for 21 points. So now they round out the rest of the Western Conference. You got fourth place in the BC division is the Vancouver Giants. In 19 games, they're 10-9-0 for 20 points. Then you got fourth place in the U.S. division. You got the Tri-City Americans, former Calgary Centennials, may I add. After 16 games, they're 7-9-0 for 14 points. Then in fifth place for the U.S. division is the Seattle Thunderbirds. After 20 games, they're 8-11-0-1 for 17 points. And then in last place in the BC division, which is fifth place, is the Victoria Royals. After 19 games, they're 2-15-1-1, so they were 6 points. So it was a tough season for the Victoria Royals. So that was the Western Conference. And I think these are all final standings now, because I don't think there's any more games in the Western Hockey League. So now look at the Eastern Conference. Well, the Edmonton Oil Kings definitely ran away with it in the Central Division. In 23 games, they're 22-0-1 for 41 points. But the Calgary Hitmen at least gave them one loss. They stole that one, so badge of honor for the Calgary Hitmen there. And then distant second place is the Medicine Hat Tigers. After 23 games, they're 14-8-0-1 for 29 points. So yeah, they're 13 points behind the Edmonton Oil Kings, but they never seem to lose. Then third place is the Calgary Hitmen. After 21 games, they're 10-8-3-0 for 23 points. So that's the Central Division, top 3. So if you look at the East Division, where it encompasses Manitoba and Saskatchewan teams, well, in Brandon Wheat Kings got first place in the East Division. After 24 games, they're 18-4-2 for 38 points. But just not too far back was Winnipeg Ice. After 24 games, they are 18-5-1 for 37 points. So Brandon and Winnipeg got to play all 24 games. So did the Saskatoon Blades. After 24 games, they're 16-5-2-1 for 35 points. So the East Division definitely was a strong division for the top 3. So now to round up the rest of the Eastern Conference, in fourth place in the Eastern Division was the Prince Albert Raiders. In 24 games, they were 9-11-3-1 for 22 points. Then in fourth place for the Central Division was the Lethbridge Hurricanes. After 24 games, they're 9-12-3-0 for 21 points. And then in fifth place is the Regina Pats in the East Division. They are 24 games, they're 9-12-2-1 for 21 points. Then in sixth place, it was the Moose Jaw Warriors in the East Division. As they're in 24 games, they're 8-13-3 for 19 points. Then I'm not too sure you consider them in the Central or they were in the East. They were at least in the East bubble, but in the Central Division, in fifth place is the Swift Current Broncos in 24 games. They're 6-16-2-0 for 14 points. And then in seventh place, when it comes to the Central Division, actually is the Red Deer Rebels. In 23 games, they're 4-15-4 and 0 for 12 points. So that's how the standings look at the end of the season. And in the description, I put the player stats in, but ultimately it was Josh Prokop who led the team in scoring with 24 points. And then when it comes to the goals, it was Sean Tessier who led the team in goals with 13. He was 13 goals, 8 assists for 21 points. Josh Prokop led the team in assists with 14. And then when it comes to plus minus, it's Josh Prokop and Riley Stotts, each leading the team with a plus minus of 12. And then the quick goaltending story is Jack Benon. He was 4-2 with a 349 goals against average and an 889 save percentage. While it's Braden Peters, who I think I'm going to say he was more or less the starter for the Calgary Hitmen, but it was kind of almost a split. When it comes to the Tatum, well, Braden Peters was 6-6. He had a 370 goals against average and an 892 save percentage. So I have the player stats in the description below just so we can capture time has to go on, because who knows? You never know with some of these players who makes it big or not in the National Hockey League. I know the Regina Pats will definitely have someone special. As you remember, Connor Bedard. Remember his name. He's going to be the player that's going to go first overall if things progress in 2023. Connor Bedard. He was granted exceptional status as a 15-year-old to join the Western Hockey League, and actually as of this recording, Canada actually beat Russia in the under-18 gold medal game, and Connor Bedard definitely had a highlight reel goal. And Connor Bedard definitely was up there, as Connor McDavid, for example, another Connor, had the exceptional status. I also remember John Tavares got granted that, and Aaron Ekblad. So we may have a special talent when it comes to look forward to. But at least, for going into the fall for the Calgary Hitmen, I mean, hopefully, things can get somewhat closer to back to normal, that we can get back in attendance and watch games again. But I'm going to say this is going to be it for That's All, folks, as Porky Pig said in Looney Tunes, for Season 3 for my Calgary Hitmen in 6. I mean, all this season was all about just getting games in and just trying to develop our younger junior hockey players. I mean, keep in mind, we just barely was able to have a season for the Calgary Hitmen and a few other teams in the Western Hockey League. Unfortunately, got hit with COVID and had some shutdowns, so they weren't able to get their 24 games in. Well, the Ontario Hockey League didn't have a season at all, and the Quebec Major Junior Hockey League had a season on and off. But the Quebec Major Junior Hockey League actually is the only league of the 3 junior hockey leagues in Canada under the Canadian Hockey League Network is actually going to have a playoffs. And then for the second straight season, there is no WHL Playoffs or Memorial Cup. So hopefully, things will finally ever get better. I mean, the mental health definitely needs it, and just outlook in life. But at least I got to recap some junior hockey games. So that's all I have for Season 3 when it comes to my Calgary Hitmen in 6. So hopefully, if there's any off-season news, anything major that happens with the Calgary Hitmen, I'll make a video on it. But I think the next time I might touch upon junior hockey is drafts, like when it comes to the National Hockey League. If any Calgary Hitmen eventually get drafted in this upcoming draft, late July, it's going to be this season, and any drafts for Bantam drafts when it comes to the Calgary Hitmen. So if there's any major news, I'll make videos on that. But I think after this episode, there's going to be very lighter when it comes to hockey content when it comes to the Calgary Hitmen. So anyways, I always like to say in my videos, if you want to follow along with this Calgary sports fan's journey, home the Flames, Hitmen, right here, Roughnecks and Stampeders. I mostly do talk Calgary sports on my YouTube channel, where I recap games, talk stories, like this for example. But I also do a variety of non-sports content, like I do some personal vlogs. I do some attempt at comedy, and attempt at comedy is what it is. It's trying to be funny. Personal vlogs is just something that's on my mind, and I also do share my experience, let's say I'm on the road or at a sport event. Hopefully I'll get to do those activities again sooner rather than later, if this damn COVID BS ever goes away and we can get on with our lives and government stop controlling us as much. Leave that for another discussion. But another thing that I've been doing a little more of, just because I need to get out more and see things, is doing some more vlogging on the go. And what I plan to do for that, as I've done already, is just, share my experiences at different parts of the city, or I did my own to Chinook Blast, or the Stampede Corral Demolition, which the Calgary Hitmen have played some games in that. So if that all sounds like it'd be interesting to watch, do follow along with this Calgary sports fan's journey. You know what you should do, just make sure you hit like and subscribe. I also have my other social links down in the description below for other ways you can follow me. So I'm going to say, yeah, let's go Hitmen. That's it for Season 3. I mean, let's just say this season was all about just getting games in, just to develop our junior hockey players, but it's definitely going to be one heck of an interesting 2021 NHL entry draft when it comes to where we value players, and will there be any more Calgary Hitmen get selected. So stay tuned, and that's the beauty of liking and subscribing, is to find out when I do upload some new videos concerning, let's say, the Calgary Hitmen or anything else that I shared on my vlogging on the go. So I just want to say thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video, and I guess I'll put this back on properly now. Alright? So thank you.